with a brief introduction to you, and take it away, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here at the 30th anniversary celebration of the remote viewing program at Stanford Research Institute. I'm Russell Targ, and the reason I'm happy to be here is that psychic research has been a passion all of my life. I was a child magician. You know that every child's favorite thing is to fool adults. So all of my time through college and graduate school, I was a stand-up magician doing mental magic, and I got into ESP research because I discovered what every magician knows is that when you quiet your mind doing a trick, you often get more information coming to you than you should have from the trick that you're doing. And as a young scientist, I thought that I should understand the research that was being done rather than continue to fool people. So I met J.B. Rhine and acquainted myself with the research and the history of parapsychological work. In the course of events, I developed an ESP teaching machine. And in the summer of 1972, I was invited to tell NASA about how you could teach an astronaut to become aware of his own psychic abilities and perhaps make contact with his spaceship. So I stood out on the pier at St. Simon's Island. I got to talk to Wernher von Braun and Jim Fletcher, who was the director of NASA, and George Pesdertz, who was an administrator, and Arthur C. Clarke, and convinced them that they should give me some money to participate in a then non-existent ESP research to examine the effects of brain waves and the possibility of developing an ESP teaching machine. And as I mentioned yesterday, the whole reason that this got started, that NASA gave us money, that Edgar Mitchell came to SRI, is because Wernher von Braun had a very psychic grandmother. And von Braun just turned to Fletcher, who was the director of NASA, and said, "My grandmother was renowned through the whole community for her psychic ability. Give those guys some money." And that's usually the basis that high-level governmental decisions are made. Everything depends on somebody's psychic grandmother. So the work that we did at SRI was supported jointly by the CIA and by NASA. And the most famous part of the work that we undertook was the psychic spying, which is why I call this the real X-Files. The X-Files are a television romance about a man and a woman looking for UFOs and making use of psychic abilities and looking for psychic spooks. Well, we were the program that went on from 1999 to 1995. From the government to do it is to have a 23-year program to do anything supported by the government. My last honest work was with Lockheed. We were putting lasers on airplanes and satellites to measure wind velocity. If we could get 3 consecutive years funding, it was a miracle, and we were doing actual useful work, preventing airplanes from crash. But the SRI program, probably one of the most paranormal things that we had is that we had 20 years of continuity from the same group of government researchers to participate in a particular kind of research. It's really remarkable, and apart from the work we did there, we must have done something reliable to have that continuing degree of support. The interesting part of psychic ability is that it has several different manifestations. You can use psychic abilities to forecast changes in the stock market. You can use psychic abilities to find parking places. You can spy on the Russians, or you can expand your awareness and discover who you are and what part your own awareness plays in the larger world. Now, I came into this program as a fairly unreconstructed physicist with many years of laser research behind me in atomic physics at Columbia University. But through the courtesy of the CIA, I got to spend 10 years sitting in the dark with my eyes shut. So you could say, in really the spirit of the Reader's Digest, that I was a psychic spy for the CIA and found God. And what occurs, as many of you realize, is that if you spend a lot of time sitting in the dark quietly, you begin to experience a number of things. Some are real and...
You might fall off the stage if you step back.
Oh, thank you very much. Ingo always takes good care of me. I'll try very hard not to fall off the stage. I'm clinging to the lectern here, actually. Thank you, Ingo. So you have an opportunity to expand your awareness and spy on the Russians, see into the distance, see into the future. See, space and time are very malleable. So the most important thing that I can tell you is that what we have found through the years of psychic research is that space and time do not interfere with the efficacy of our psychic abilities. It's no harder to describe a target site in the Soviet Union than it is across the street in Palo Alto. It's no harder to describe a target which has not yet been chosen than it is to describe an object on the table that's hidden. In workshops that I do, I will often have 6 bags sitting on the table, and each one will have an interesting object in it. And I will ask the audience to describe what I'm going to show you in a few minutes that has not been chosen. And I'm confident enough that I can elicit psychic functioning that we really have the opportunity for failure here. But I will invite people to describe what I'm going to show them. Someone will throw a die on the floor. Bag number 3 is chosen, and I will pull the object out of bag number 3. And what I found now for several years is the great preponderance of the people will describe the object that they're going to be shown, even though the object was not chosen until a later time. We call this ability for our awareness to transcend the ordinary bounds of space and time a non-local connection. Now, ESP research didn't invent the idea of non-locality. Non-locality is the hottest thing in modern physics. If I were a young graduate student studying physics, I would no doubt be involved in research in non-locality. The non-locality pertains to the fact that in physics, elementary particles and photons that should be separated from one another are in fact connected. In 1935, Einstein was writing about quantum physics, which he didn't like very much. He didn't like the loosey-goosey uncertainty principle, indeterminacy aspect, and he famously said that God doesn't play dice with the universe. And he said quantum theory predicts that if photons created together travel away from one another at the speed of light, quantum mechanics predicts that they're still connected. Since that strongly violates special relativity, which works very well, Einstein said quantum mechanics can't be correct. And that's the way things were until 1969, when Friedman and Clauser at the University of California, Berkeley, did that experiment and demonstrated that non-local connection. It's called non-local because no two things can be more separated than photons traveling away from each other at the speed of light. And what Einstein described as a ghostly connection at a distance, sometimes translated as a telepathic connection at a distance, does exist. So Einstein was correct in his analysis. Quantum mechanics does predict this non-local connection, even though it appears to be a violation of special relativity. These experiments have now been done by Aspect in Paris, where he collected the light by turning a polarizer so fast that it was turned even before the photon could reach the polarizer, and recently by Nicholas Geeson did the very important experiments for which he'll probably get a Nobel Prize. With his twin photons generated by a laser, he sat in Geneva with the laser. One polarizing system was in Basel and the other was in Zurich. And what he demonstrated is that if you turn the polarizer in Zurich, you observe a change in Basel 10 kilometers away. So this is not a tabletop experiment. It's the kind of fearful thing that every physicist worries about. When I'm sitting at the laboratory table doing an experiment in Palo Alto, I don't want to have to worry that Ingo is doing some experiment in San Francisco and is going to affect my experiment. I like to feel that my experiment is contained in my laboratory. We know that that's a false hope. We live in a non-local universe in which things are remarkably interconnected. These twin photons are like identical twins that I'm sure you've read about. Even Scientific American recently had an article about identical twins born together but reared apart. They talked about the Jim brothers. People were so confused with these twins that they both got named Jim, but they were one brought up in New York and the other brought up in the Midwest, in Kansas. But when they were brought together, appropriate at the Twin City, of course, is Minneapolis, University of Minneapolis has a twin study. So when the Jim brothers were brought together, it was discovered that they had both married two different women named Linda, whom they divorced. They then married two women named Betty, and both men were firemen. And just before coming to the twin study, they felt compelled to build a white circular bench around a tree in their backyard. Now, we all can suppose that DNA can describe some of the connections between identical twins. Mozart and his father were great pianists, and you might assume that there are piano-playing genes in the Mozart family or in the Bach family. But we don't think that there are Linda and Betty genes or even fireman genes. So because these two men have trillions of molecules that are all identical in their DNA, we can suppose that there's a kind of resonance that transcends the space between them and allows a kind of powerful subliminal telepathy that exists between them. And I think the evidence for that twin connection is very strong. Now, even though this is Henry Stapp, who's chairman of the physics department at the University of California in Berkeley, Stapp said that the discovery of non-locality is probably the most profound discovery in all of physics, because it shows that we profoundly misapprehend the nature of the space and time that we live in. The idea that we are connected to one another in consciousness is not a metaphysical principle necessarily. One of my favorite people is Erwin Schrödinger, who perfected quantum mechanics by developing the wave equations. Schrödinger was a great polymath of the middle 20th century. He got a Nobel Prize for solving the problem of how to use quantum mechanics. And then during the Second World War, he developed the idea of the genetic code. But during his lifetime, he was a committed Vedantist who believed in the connection of all consciousness. And in one of his books, The Meaning of Life, Schrödinger wrote, "Consciousness is a singularity of which there is no plural. The appearance of multiple consciousness is an optical illusion, as though you're standing in a hall of mirrors seeing the reflection of other consciousness." So he felt that consciousness is singular. And this old idea, this idea of the fact that we're connected in consciousness, is one of the things that appears throughout the Buddhist teachings. I know we're supposed to be talking about the X-Files, but the idea of this connection, that the idea that there are no secrets, is a very, very old idea. the Buddhist teachings, the collection of Buddhist writings called the Prajna Paramita. It's the highest wisdom. And on every page of the Buddhist teachings, you find that separation is an illusion, that there is only one consciousness here. In consciousness, there is only one person in this big room. And this is really the oldest awareness. And what the Buddhists teach is that you have an opportunity to reside in our familiar condition, which is called conditioned existence, where we are affected in our awareness by all of our prejudices and the things that have happened to us before in our lives. And this conditioned existence keeps us from experiencing who we are or what's happening in the universe. The opportunity we have to move ourselves from this conditions is the prayer and the hope of Buddhist teachings and Hindu teachings to move into timeless existence. And these ideas are very nicely exemplified in Ingo's painting here. There's a painting by Ingo Swann that he calls the cosmic egg. And what I believe and what the data from psychic research indicates is that we generally reside down here in the shell. There's a shell of conditioned existence. We have the opportunity to expand our awareness into the realm of timeless existence. One of the very significant things that Ingo taught in remote viewing is that it is critically important to overcome analytical overlay. Analytical overlay is what you guess the right answer is based on your fragmentary images. If I ask you to describe an object that I'm going to show you in a minute, you'll say, I see something circular, it must be a coin. Or I see something long, it must be a Swiss Army knife. The tendency to make a guess, to do analysis, is the enemy of psychic functioning. It's a manifestation of an analytical overlay. Is equivalent to living in a situation of conditioned existence. So although Ingo was principally teaching us how to do remote viewing, he taught that in order to function psychically, we have to overcome the tendency to have recourse to memory, imagination, and analysis. All three of those things are the enemy of psychic functioning. Our tendency to analyze what the target is interferes with our ability. For example, if I said, I'm thinking of a number from 1 to 10, can you tell me my number? That would be a very, very difficult task to do, because you would start by saying, well, it wouldn't be 1 or it wouldn't be 10 because he mentioned those numbers, and 7 is everybody's favorite number, so therefore, and that's not psychic functioning, that's analysis. On the other hand, if I say I can visualize a place from an infinity of possible places on the planet, I have been to this one interesting place that most of you have probably never seen, that turns out to be a very easy task. And it's one of the many paradoxes of psychic functioning that it's easier to choose psychically. It's easier for you to psychically perceive one of an infinitude of possible locations than it is to guess my number from 1 to 10. And that's because guessing the number from 1 to 10 is an invitation to participate in the guessing game, to do analysis, and to have recourse to your memory. Stephen mentioned earlier that the ESP cards were a very bad target. And that's because once you have seen a square, a circle, a star, wavy lines, and a cross, those simple images are burned into your memory and dirty your mental slate forever. So if I tell you I'm thinking of a circle, a square, or a cross, what's my mental picture? You have basically no way to do that unless you're a great practiced psychic, because your mind is filled with these images. Ingo has done a number of remarkable ESP experiments, and the one I think is the very most remarkable is one he did with Hal Potoff a number of years ago toward the end of the program, where Hal would choose day after day one of two different possible targets. So you have a target like rectangular graph paper and a target like polar coordinate graph paper. That's the target. Ingo knew the target, and Ingo then had to exercise his prodigious abilities of discernment to recognize that it could be circular, it could be cross-section, and then see which one it actually was. It's an exceptionally difficult task. It's a task that requires that one have the ability to separate out memory and imagination from the psychic target. See, when you close your eyes to do a remote viewing, it would be wonderful if of the images you see this one is brought to you by ESP. It's unfortunately not the way it works. What I teach people to do invariably is to look for the surprising image, the fragmentary image. When I'm interviewing somebody in a blind situation and the person says, I've got a clear image, this looks to me like a cheese grater, I say, let's start over, don't tell me about your cheese grater. If the person says, I don't know what the hell I'm looking at, all I see are these funny lines that go from left to right, I'm almost certain that that's going to be a correct psychic image because it sounds like ESP. So as an experienced interviewer, even though I'm blind as to the target or the possible target, I can greatly help a person separate out their memory and their imagination, because through 30 years of interviewing, I know what psychic functioning sounds like. I know what the emergence of the image sounds like. So I'm able to assist a person in getting in touch with the images that actually correspond to their psychic perception. And it's a separating out analytical overlay, which I believe is the same as conditioned existence. So I think that Ingo, in his derivation of the idea analytical overlay, has a kind of 20th century view of the ancient Buddhist idea of conditioned existence, which is a kind of, as we go through our day, we have a tendency to live our lives in a state of analytical overlay. And I think that Ingo is inviting us to expand our awareness, just as the Buddhists and the Dzogchen masters were inviting us to reside in the timeless state of timeless existence and expand our awareness to take part in a larger universe that's free of the anxieties and fears and judgments that interfere with our ordinary perception. Now I think that I will show you some slides that are from the program that we did, but I again want to give you the idea that as Stephen gave you the history of what went on in the 16th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, what we're doing is really a very old idea. 100 years after Buddha, that is, Buddha was 500 years BC, writing prodigiously of the extent to which there is no separation, that our personal awareness, our Atman, our self, is equivalent to Brahman, the whole physical universe, that there is no separation, that our awareness fills all of space and time. This is the again and again repeated effort for the Buddha to communicate. 100 years after Buddha, Patanjali, who is a great Dharma master, Hindu teacher, the Dharma is the organizing principle of the universe. So these great Dharma masters were people who routinely could expand their awareness, and the great ones could tell us what that was like. See, many contemporary people say, I had this experience, or I took this drug, or I meditated, and what happened was indescribable. It's ineffable. There's no words for what happened. The great masters actually tell you what happened. And that's why we read things that were written thousands of years ago, because the people resided permanently in those states and could communicate what they were experiencing. Patanjali wrote a book which is still in print. It's called How to Know God. And every author loves the idea of a book still in print written 2,400 years ago. It makes every author happy to see this occurring. In Patanjali's sutras, he says that when you quiet your mind and when you stop every last ripple of noise so that the pond of your mental screen is totally without ripples, when the last ripple is quiet, the true answer pops into view. And among those true answers, he said that you can look into the distance, you can look into the future, you can heal the sick, and you can diagnose illnesses psychically. I have been helping people for many years to get in touch with the part of themselves, to get in touch with that part of themselves that's psychic, that allows them to look into the distance, allows them to look into the future. Medical researchers are now doing experiments in distant prayer, where people across the country will pray for people who are sick, in work that my daughter Elizabeth Targ has done at California Pacific Medical Center. She had people across the country pray for half of her AIDS patients. The 30 AIDS patients receiving the prayers in double-blind studies had much better outcome than the 30 controls, even though everyone wished to be prayed for. And this work has now been replicated in several other universities and published in mainstream medical journals. So in a way, the medical research on distant mental influence and distant prayer is ahead of the ESP research in general acceptance. And what she found is that if you receive prayers and are ill, you have a significantly better chance of recovering than people who did not receive the prayers. So the take-home message from that is that if you're sick and someone offers to pray for you, you should accept the prayers even if you don't believe in that stuff, because it works even if you don't believe in it. And the other part of this that I'm just getting interested in personally is medical diagnosis. Now, people have written about medical diagnosis for the past 25 years. Carolyn Meese has written books with Norm Shealy. Mona Lisa Schultz, the physician, has written books, a very good book called Awakening Intuition. Our friend Judith Orloff has written a couple of books. One is called Second Sight. Shafraga Karagula has written books about Dora Kunz, who invented therapeutic touch. All of these people are talking about psychic diagnosis. Of course, nobody has done double-blind studies, but I'm just beginning to study anatomy and physiology. That's been my project since I saw you last year. And the anomalous, surprising thing I can tell you is that doing intuitive diagnosis of illness is easier than doing remote viewing. I don't know why that is. I've talked at length with Judith Orloff, who's a physician, psychiatrist, and she has the same experience. But even in a double-blind situation, somebody hands me an envelope with a card inside. Nobody knows what patient is described on that card. It is much easier to describe in detail the physiology and the illness of the patient on that card than it is to describe a National Geographic picture. So I'm exploring that and may go on and do some formal double-blind experiments. I'm not saying that I'm a great medical intuitive. I've only been doing this half a year, but I would share with you the surprise that it's easier to do than remote viewing. So all of the things that Patanjali talked about 2,400 years ago are available, correctly described, and we can do them today. So I'm going to take away Ingo's nice picture with the idea that you want to, well, you took it away, anyway, that's all right, that you want to learn to reside in this starry region. I try very hard not to shine my laser in my eyes. You want to reside in this space of timeless existence. It's a space available to you if you're able to overcome the analytical overlay and the judgment that causes us suffering each day. Then you can pop out of this murky area of conditioned awareness, of analytical overlay, and expand into this beautiful story regime that Ingo has made available to us. One of the very first experiments that we did at SRI with Ingo was a target in which the CIA sent us geographical coordinates. Ingo had been doing experiments with Hal and me in which we did physicist kind of experiments. There's a laser in the box. Ingo, can you tell us whether the laser is turned on or not? Or there's a picture in the envelope, can you describe the picture? And Ingo said in one of his many offers to go home, he said that if you don't give me something more interesting to look at, I'm going back to New York. What you're asking me to do is a trivialization of my ability, said Ingo. I can focus my attention anywhere on the planet. If I want to see what's in the envelope, I'll open the envelope. So we began this series of scanning by coordinates. It became called Project Scanate. This is one of the very first ones. And Hal read the coordinates to Ingo, just geographical coordinates. Ingo called for several pieces of paper and just began to draw what became an island. And one of the paranormal things here is that it became a closed figure, because you see he's drawing on several different pieces of paper. And he said there's a mountain on the left and an airport on the right. And he said this is some kind of island with a mountain and airport, and he had a number of other things to say. We then went to the National Geographic, and we found that the target was Kerguelen Island in the South Indian Ocean. And you see there is a mountain on the left. And after a year of conversation with the CIA, we discovered that there was an airport on the right. And you see that the fjords and inlets that Ingo drew here, so it's not working. There we go. You see these inlets here, and the fjords and inlets that Ingo drew are greatly replicated in the actual target site. So the CIA was very impressed with this. Of course, when we went to the National Geographic, Hal and I had done a number of these experiments, and we went to the National Geographic Society and told them about Ingo's great ability to describe and draw distant images. And we showed him pictures that he drew of Mount Hekla, which is a volcano in Iceland. And Ingo was very angry with us because he said, you invited me to separate my awareness from the body, and you dropped me right into this volcano. But as we briefed the National Geographic Society, an elderly geographer in the back got up and said to us, I don't know what you whippersnappers is implied were talking about. You gave this man coordinates in the South Indian Ocean. Everybody knows that the only thing at those coordinates is Kerguelen Island. So why is that so special? And that gave rise to what we began to call the memorize the globe hypothesis. So we went on to a kind of psychic hide and go seek where you couldn't memorize it. We would randomly choose a target location. A traveler would go to that location, and I would, since I don't drive, as many of you caught on to, I don't see very well, so I don't have a driving license. So I was always the stay-at-home partner, and my job was to sit in the dark with the interviewer and help him describe where the people had gone to hide in conditions where I had no idea where in principle they had gone. I didn't know the target pool. One of the people who called us to work with us was a police commissioner, Pat Price. He was police commissioner of Burbank. Stephen just showed this picture. The way this worked in our psychic hide and go seek is that Pat and I would sit in the electrically shielded room at SRI. Pat would polish his glasses and close his eyes and say, I see a rectangular pool that's 68 by 75, and a round pool is 100 feet in diameter in a little blockhouse. The visitors would come back from where they had gone, which in this case is Rinconada Swimming Pool Complex, show us the map, and we would see that the swimming pool is really 110 feet in diameter and 75 by 100. So what we saw in this early experiment with our psychic policeman, that he could sit at SRI in a shielded room and describe with 90% accuracy the size of objects hidden away. Now, Price also went on to say, I see two big water tanks here. So this must be a water purification plant. So we said, aha, it's an example of analytical overlay. Price is involved in the building trades, city management. He saw the water and made it into a water purification plant. And that's a story that I told for quite a number of years. Made sense. Wasn't correct, but made sense. What I learned 5 years ago at the centenary of the city of Palo Alto, they sent us a picture book from the city of Palo Alto 100 years ago and 50 years ago, is that Rinconada Park used to be a water purification plant. And 50 years ago, the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto were these two water tanks located right where Price drew them. So what he apparently did is follow our friends to the swimming pool complex, describe what was there, and then move 50 years back the timeline and describe the most interesting thing at the site at the earlier time. So it's very important when you give somebody a task and say, we have a target that needs a description, you invite them to describe the target today. Probably our most famous publicized remote viewing activity is a description of a Soviet weapons factory in Semipalatinsk in Soviet Siberia. Hal and I went to the CIA a number of times, as he described, in our effort to work with them, get financial support for our program. We talked to many people. We talked to head of operations who said, this is a very interesting program. I'm not going to give you any money, because I have found every time I get a new idea, if I say no to them, I'm right 90% of the time. But our great supporter, Kit Green, took us up to the Director of Intelligence, who was John McMahon. John McMahon looked at our data. Hal and I had both had previous associations in our earlier incarnations. Both of us had done things with CIA, and they knew that we had published papers and were known scientists. And John McMahon said, you guys are wasting your time describing swimming pools and churches in Palo Alto. We actually have targets in the Soviet Union that are have national security interests. If you can describe our targets, we'll support your program. And the first target we did of that operational type was this now famous set of cranes targeted Semipalatinsk. Price described lying on his back psychically, looking up as the crane would roll over his body as he was lying on a building. And he said, this is such a complicated thing that I'm going to have to draw it. And he drew this little crane. We then took that downstairs, showed it to the CIA physicist who was with us for the experiment. He unrolled this picture, which is a airbrushed version of a satellite photograph. And here's the photograph of the crane. Here's a crane. And he said, Price is probably at the right place. His 8-wheeled crane, which he called a gantry, greatly resembles the gantry crane at the site. But of course, we already knew that was there. And that's what government officials always tell us. When we get a very strong hit at a target site that can be confirmed, they say, well, that's a nice demonstration, but actually we already knew that. Can't you tell us something we didn't know, which we can't confirm? And Price then went on the next day to describe what they were doing inside this building. He said they're constructing a steel sphere 60 feet in diameter, which they're assembling from gores, which are orange peel shaped things that they're struggling to weld together. 2 years later, after Price's death, the Russians rolled out this big sphere, and it was seen by American satellites and photographed. And what it was conjectured is the Russians were building a particle beam weapon at that site for the purpose of shooting down the satellites that were taking these pictures. And we had a congressional investigation and had a chance to stand in the floor of the House Committee on Intelligence Oversight, and our sponsors stood up and said, it's really true, there is no security leak, and the Congressional Committee told us to press on, which we did then for another 15 years. One day in a series of experiments, Price did not show up. Hal was traveling through South America, and our task was to describe where he was each day. And Price would say things like, I see a volcano, I see a marketplace, I see a church, South American kind of things, and we received no feedback. And one day Price didn't come. And I had already put on the tape, this is a remote viewing experiment with Russ Targ and Pat Price. But in the idea that the show must go on, I closed my eyes and made the little drawing at the bottom. And I said, there's an airport here and a sand and grass on the right, hangar on the left, ocean at the end of the runway. That's what I get. What do you know? Hal came back 10 days later. He had taken a side trip to San Andreas, which is an island airport off the coast of Colombia, and our judges were able to successfully match my drawing with the target location. As Ingo would say, it shows that even a scientist can be psychic if the necessity level is high enough. After working with Ingo and Pat Price, the CIA said, don't you know any regular people, that is people who are not famous for their psychic prowess, can an ordinary person do what these experienced psychics are doing? And as Stephen described, I invited my friend Hella Hamid, who is a professional photographer, Life magazine photographer, who promised me she had never done any psychic stuff before, never done anything like that. And we brought her into the control. In her first trial, I had a moment of truth because now I'm working with somebody who had never done remote viewing. So as I sat on the floor of our little laboratory living room, Hella was lying on a couch and she says, what do I do? I'm ready to participate. Tell me what to do. So at that point, I had to sort of invent what to say to a subject who had never done this before. And in the series of experiments we did with Hella, I knew about taking breaks and analytical overlay from Ingo's teaching, of course. And Hella's first impression was one of motion. She said, I see this motion going on, and we took a break. And then she said, I say trough up in the air. And then she took a break, and she said, if you stand where Hal is standing, you see these squares within squares within squares, which she drew. And this is, of course, a good rendition of what was there, and again, successfully matched by judges downstream in a 9-trial series. Now, it was interesting in this was Hella's very first trial, and she worked with us for a decade and did not show any degradation in her psychic ability. One of the hallmarks of Rhine's work, guessing squares, stars, and circles, is that people inevitably declined. It's as though Rhine had found a way to extinguish ESP in the laboratory. But we did not find that in our work. Hella was a great technophobe. She was not at all technically inclined. It was a struggle for her to change batteries in her light meter. So it was not a service to her one day. We gave her geographical coordinates in binary form. I handed her a card and said, what do you see at these coordinates? 110011 and 0110. She said, that's a nice pattern. And she closed her eyes and said, this is a very strange location. She made this drawing here and said, this looks like a belly button shaped energy expander. This is what a non-scientist says when she experiences the Berkeley Bevatron, a particle accelerator. See, there is in fact a circular accelerator here with a belly button in the middle, and the particle beams come out these beam tubes, and Hella drew these beam tubes. This is a case of a subject, a remote viewer having absolutely no idea what she's drawing, but at this point she's extremely experienced, surrender to the experience and make a drawing of what she sees, even though it doesn't make any analytical sense. One of our other volunteers who walked in had not done remote viewing was Gary Langford. He's a SRI analyst who was looking at satellite photographs and could always see things that no one else could see. You see one little grain of silver, and he said, it looks like they're manufacturing trucks inside. And people said, how do you know that? He said, well, it just came to me. And in one of the experiments we did with him, I finally escaped from the laboratory and managed to go to New Orleans. And I threw a die on the pavement and chose the New Orleans Superdome as a hiding place. Gary made this nice drawing replicating where I was. As I stood there, I said into my tape, I'm at the New Orleans Superdome. It looks like nothing so much as a flying saucer shining in the sun, which is obviously what it looks like. Poor Gary back in the laboratory, working with Elizabeth Rauscher, another physicist, said, I close my eyes here, Elizabeth, and all I see is this damn UFO. And Elizabeth, the intrepid interviewer, said, that's fine, Gary. Sounds like a good surprising image. I don't think Russell's been abducted. Why don't you just draw what you see? And we've done many, many trials with Gary with great success. The last viewer I'll tell you about is Joe McMoneagle, who came to our laboratory as one of 6 Army intelligence recruits that Hal and I chose with the help of Skip Atwater from the INSCOM facility. This is 1979. An interesting sidelight, my late wife was the sister of Bobby Fischer, and my wife Joan got to teach Bobby Fischer how to play chess, and of course Bobby became the chess champion of the world. Now, it doesn't mean that Joan was a great chess champion, but she had always tickled her when Bobby would say, oh yes, my sister taught me to play. Well, my great claim to fame is that I taught Joe McMoneagle how to do remote viewing. And he grew up to be one of the most successful remote viewers alive today. Doesn't say anything about my ability. I just had a great talented person cross my horizon. The very first trial I did with Joe, following the protocol we always had at SRI, a target was chosen. Hal and another person would go and hide. Joe made a whole series of little sketches around the edge of the paper and said, basically, it's a building in 2 parts. A low part in the back, a tall part in the center, and this is what I get. And the place they had gone to the Stanford University Art Museum. So this is trial number 1 in Joe's highly successful series of introductory trials in 1979 at Stanford Research Institute. 10 years later, the program was still going on, had moved to SAIC. Ed May was then running the program. And as always, the CIA operative will show up and say, we're thinking of continuing the program. If only you can show us something psychic, we might give you some more money to continue. So this is 10 years later. The protocol here was that the CIA agent said, I'm going to go someplace in an hour, And then an hour later, I'm going to another place, and I have not yet decided where I'm going. I guess it's 2 hours travel time. It's 8 o'clock now. At 10 o'clock, I'll be somewhere, and 11 o'clock, I'll be somewhere else, and I'd like you to describe where I am. At 10 o'clock, he had gone to our very own atomic bomb factory at Lawrence Livermore, 100 miles east of SRI. They were at this 6-story T-shaped building covered with glass. Back in the laboratory with Ed May, Joe said, I see this 6-story T-shaped building covered with glass. It's some kind of R&D facility. Here's a row of trees. There's a row of trees. An hour later, the traveler went to another site. Joe said, I see some foothills. There are tall towers. This is part of some kind of electrical grid. I see motion at the top of the towers. And where he had gone is the Altamont Windmill Farm in Altamont, California, about 150 miles east of SRI. So the important thing to notice here is that after a decade of work doing remote viewing, we do not see any decline in the viewer's ability. Remote viewing is an intellectual task. You learn to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise. You learn to become in touch with the analytical overlay and reject that. An experienced viewer said, this is not a surprise. This is what I saw driving down the freeway. This is my memory of the interesting movie I saw last night. So you develop discernment to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise, to recognize when something is a memory, an analysis, or an imagining. And over a period of many years, you have the opportunity to perfect this as you learn to expand your awareness. Now, the payoff for this can be in many different aspects. People endlessly write to me on the internet, how can you use remote viewing to forecast the lotto? Can you use this to decide what stock to buy? And we have done those things. As you may know, that in the 1980s, we were working with a very enthusiastic investor and made a lot of money forecasting silver futures. And when I was interested in writing a book, having gotten this declassified through Freedom of Information, you notice that one of the slides says secret on the top and bottom. When my co-author Jane Katra and I wrote Miracles of Mind, our publisher was concerned about publishing secret documents. So we included the letter from the CIA saying that it was okay to publish this material I had received from Freedom of Information. But Jane and I also did another associative remote viewing experiment, forecasting silver, just sitting on the living room floor of my house, describing little objects provided to us by 2 other scientists. The publisher said, if you people are describing in your book how to be psychic, we described the SRI protocol in Miracles of Mind, publisher said, you guys ought to demonstrate that you can actually do this. So in our forecast, we were correct 11 out of 12 times, forecasting changes of silver, showing that even inexperienced, ordinary people can learn to do this remote viewing following the simple protocol. The subsequent book we wrote, Heart of the Mind, we describe the answer to the question, why bother with ESP? That is, we're not interested in spying on the Russians. We're not particularly interested in forecasting silver futures. Why would you want to learn to do this? Why would you take the time? And what we found, what anyone finds who learns to quiet their mind, is that you discover that between the inflow of psychic abilities, the inflow of these images, and the outflow of your healing intention, every mystic discovers that there's a quiet place where you have the opportunity to drop into the space of loving awareness, where you can experience that flow of loving awareness that the mystics say represents who you actually are. So you can leave the life of analytical overlay. You can leave the life of conditioned awareness and move into Ingo's timeless existence, the space of loving awareness. Jesus called the peace that passes understanding. The Buddhists call ananda or bliss. Every spiritual tradition has a description of this kind of loving syrup. The Buddhists talk about heart essence. In English, we talk about love, which people always associate with romantic love, but this is not at all what the mystics are talking about. It's hard to believe this is actually beyond boyfriends and girlfriends, but it's an opportunity to discover who you are. That you can wake up in the morning in gratitude, because the one thing that can never be taken away from you is your connection with your loving self. Viktor Frankl, when he was in the concentration camp, created a philosophy of optimism and spiritual psychology. He said that the one thing they can never take away from me, even though they can torture my body or take away my food, you can't separate me from my spirituality. The one thing that you can always wake up in gratitude for is your connection with the divine, with your connection with this timeless aspect that every remote viewer can contact. This is an aspect of the universe outside your own physical body. You learn that you are not a physical body, but rather you are awareness, and a remote viewer notices that he or she is free to travel through space, through time, has nothing to do with your physical body, and you can learn to reside in this loving space, or you can do what you ordinarily do. In Silicon Valley, where I live, discernment is very important. There's a day without judgment is like a day without sunshine in Silicon. So what I invite you to do is to make the choice whether you want to wake up in judgment, wake up in analytical overlay, the situation of conditioned awareness, or wake up in timeless awareness, and I invite you to make the choice and be in love. Thank you.